The minute I stepped into the mahogany-paneled law office, my son looked straight at me and said, "Mom, maybe you should wait outside. This part's just for family." I froze. I am his family. I carried him for 9 months, raised him through chicken pox and heartbreaks. And now, in the very room where my late husband's will was about to be read, I was being told I didn't belong. What happened next would change everything I thought I knew about my son, my daughter-in-law, and the truth my husband had been keeping from all of us. Before I tell you what went down in that office, stay with me until the very end, because you won't believe the turn this story takes. And while you're here, drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far my story travels. My name is Margaret Cole, but folks around here just call me Margie. I've lived in Charleston my whole life, in a white clapboard house with creaky floors and a porch swing that's seen better days. For the last 3 years, I've been retired from nursing, spending my days caring for Henry, my husband of 42 years, through his heart failure. I thought the hardest day of my life was the day I held his hand in the ICU, as the monitors went silent. I was wrong. That morning, the air had that heavy, salty thickness we get before a summer storm. I remember tightening Henry's old navy scarf around my neck. Not because I needed it, but because it still smelled faintly like his aftershave, the kind he insisted on using even when the doctors told him scents could trigger breathing trouble. As I drove downtown, the wipers kept smearing fine drops of mist across the windshield, making the old oaks along Meeting Street look like ghosts through the glass. My stomach had been in knots since Sophie, my son Ryan's wife, called me 2 days ago to remind me about the will reading. She'd said it in that syrupy sweet tone that always made me feel like she was holding back something sharp. Walking into that law office felt like stepping into another world. Polished brass handles, thick carpet that muffled every step, and the faint smell of leather-bound books. I'd barely had time to glance at the family portraits on the wall before Ryan's words cut through the air, each syllable clipped and careful, as if rehearsed. And behind him, Sophie stood with her mother, their identical blonde bobs angled toward each other like a pair of hawks watching a rabbit. My pulse hammered in my ears. Part of me wanted to turn around, to spare myself whatever humiliation was coming. But another part, the one that had worked double shifts to put Ryan through college, the one that had stayed awake for 48 hours straight during a hurricane to keep patients alive, that part refused to move. I told myself I'd stay, no matter how unwelcome they made me feel, because deep down I knew something wasn't right, and I wasn't going to let them write me out of my own life. Ryan didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The way he avoided my eyes as he said, "Mom, you really should wait outside," felt colder than any shout could have been. I searched his face for some hint of hesitation, some flicker of the boy who used to bring me seashells from Sullivan's Island when he was little. There was nothing. "This isn't about you," Sophie's mother, Linda, added, her drawl polished but sharp as a letter opener. "We just need to handle a few family matters." She drew out the word family like I wasn't part of the definition. I stood there clutching Henry's scarf like a lifeline, feeling my knees soften. The law office's chandelier light seemed suddenly too bright, reflecting off the polished table until I had to squint. All I could hear was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. Mr. Jacobs, Henry's attorney, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Cole, I'd prefer everyone stay. Your presence is necessary," Sophie cut in. her manicured hand resting lightly on Ryan's forearm, as if to steady him through the ordeal of having me in the room. With all due respect, Mr. Jacobs, this part is really between Ryan and us. She didn't even finish the sentence, letting the silence erase me. I wanted to speak up. I wanted to say, I'm his wife of 42 years. I held his hand through every operation. I was there at 3 a.m. when his chest pains came back. I earned my place in this room. But my voice felt lodged somewhere deep in my chest, trapped behind the lump that had been living there for months now, ever since the diagnosis. Stage 1 lung cancer, caught early, but still, the kind of news that rearranges every cell of your life. I hadn't told Ryan, I hadn't told anyone. The thought of adding my illness to the weight of Henry's failing heart felt cruel, so I'd swallowed it. The scans, the quiet panic attacks in the shower, the smell of antiseptic that clung to my hair after my first appointment with the oncologist. I told myself I'd wait until Henry was stronger. Then Henry was gone. And now, here I was, being told I didn't matter enough to hear my own husband's final words. "I'll wait," I whispered. I don't even know if they heard me. Ryan gave the smallest nod, relief flashing across his face like a cloud passing over the sun, and they turned away. As I stepped toward the door, I caught sight of Sophie leaning in to whisper something to her mother. Linda's lips curled into a smirk. I knew that look. I'd seen it at Christmas dinner 2 years ago, when I'd given them both handmade scarves instead of expensive store-bought gifts. It was the look of someone quietly taking inventory of what they thought you were worth and finding you lacking. The waiting room was colder than I remembered. My fingers trembled as I sank into a leather chair, the kind that looked comfortable but felt like it was designed to keep you on edge. The receptionist glanced up briefly, then back at her screen. Her indifference made me feel even more invisible. I tried to focus on the framed watercolors on the wall, scenes of Charleston streets in spring, but the conversation behind the heavy oak door seeped through in muffled bursts. A laugh here, a raised voice there. Every sound scraped raw against my nerves. I pressed the scarf to my lips, breathing in the faint trace of Henry, willing it to anchor me. That's when the memory hit me. 3 weeks before Henry died, I'd overheard Sophie on the phone in the kitchen. "No, she's not handling Dad's illness well at all," she'd said, her voice low but firm. "She's forgetful, unreliable. Honestly, I'm worried about her mental state." I'd stood frozen in the hallway, holding a mug of tea that had gone cold in my hands. Every word was a lie. I remembered everything. Every pill, every dosage, every appointment. But in that moment, I realized she was laying the groundwork, painting me as incompetent, so no one would question it later, when I was left out of decisions. I should have confronted her right then. Instead, I'd walked back into Henry's room, smiled, and told him the tea was ready. I'd kept my voice steady, my hands gentle, because that's what you do when you've been a caregiver your whole life. You swallow your hurt so the person you're protecting doesn't have to carry it. In the law office's sterile chill, I felt that same ache bloom again, deep and familiar. Only this time, Henry wasn't there to shield. The people behind that door weren't strangers. They were my own flesh and blood, and yet they'd already decided I was expendable. A shadow moved across the frosted glass. I caught a glimpse of Ryan leaning back in his chair, Sophie's hand still on his arm. I wondered if he remembered the nights I worked double shifts, so he could have new cleats for baseball season. If he remembered how I'd driven 3 hours in a storm to bring him home from college when his car broke down. Or if all of that had been neatly packed away in the attic of his mind, labeled no longer relevant. My chest tightened. Not from the cancer, not from fear, but from the sharp, clean sting of betrayal. I didn't know what was being said in that room, but I knew one thing. Whatever was in Henry's will, whatever he'd left behind, they didn't want me to hear it, and that meant I needed to. I straightened in the chair, my fingers smoothing the creases in Henry's scarf. I might have been locked out of that room, but I wasn't going to let them lock me out of the truth. The longer I sat in that leather chair, the clearer it became. They didn't just want me out of the room, they wanted me erased. My mind replayed Sophie's phone call from weeks ago, her careful lies, Linda's little smirk. This wasn't about etiquette, it was a strategy. The door finally opened. Sophie stepped out with the kind of smile you'd give a stranger who just held the elevator for you. Polite, but empty. "We'll call you back in when we're done," she said, already turning away. Done. That word felt final, like a nail being tapped into a coffin. When they disappeared down the hall toward Mr. Jacobs' private conference room, I slipped out of the waiting area. My feet knew where I was going before my head caught up. Henry and I had been in this office before, back when he updated our will after Ryan got married. There was a side corridor, lined with old maritime paintings and dusty legal volumes, and at the end of it, a small glass door that opened to the building's back porch. I wasn't about to press my ear to the conference door. That wasn't my style. But I also wasn't going to just sit there and let my life be divided up like I was some footnote. I stepped outside into the muggy Charleston air, letting the warm humidity wrap around me. The river was just beyond the parking lot, shimmering in the late morning light. I pulled my phone from my purse and scrolled to a number I hadn't dialed in months. Tom Whitaker. Tom had been Henry's fishing buddy for decades. He knew more about our family than most of our relatives did. He also had a knack for, let's just say, keeping his ears open in all the right places. "Margie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was hoping you'd call me before all this went down." "You've heard?" I asked, leaning against the porch railing. "Small town, sweetheart, news travels faster than the tide." He paused. "Henry left something for you. Not through the lawyer, said it was just in case." My grip tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "A letter and a copy of a document he didn't want Sophie getting her hands on." My heart kicked hard against my ribs. A letter from Henry and another document. "Tom, where is it?" "Safe," he said. "At my place. But you'll need to come by today, before certain people realize it's missing from where it used to be." That was all I needed to hear. I ended the call, just as the conference room door opened again. Ryan's voice floated down the hall, low and serious. I slipped back into the waiting area before they saw me, settling into my chair as if I hadn't moved. Moments later, Ryan walked past me without a glance, Sophie in tow. Mr. Jacobs followed, holding a folder so thick it looked like it could hold the blueprint to Fort Sumter. "Mrs. Cole," he said, stopping beside me, "we'll need you in here shortly." His gaze flickered, as if there was something he wanted to say but couldn't in front of them. Then he gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, before heading back to his office. I knew that look. It was the same one Henry used to give me across a crowded room when we were keeping a surprise between us. Something was in that will they didn't want me to see. And now I had two sources. whatever Mr. Jacobs was about to read, and whatever Tom was holding. That thought steadied me. On the drive home later, I'd take the long route by the harbor, stopping at Tom's little blue-shuttered house. But for now, I needed to keep my face neutral, my voice calm. Every instinct from my nursing years kicked in. How to monitor a crisis without showing panic, how to observe details others missed. From where I sat, I could see Sophie scrolling her phone, her lips pressed thin. Ryan was staring at the floor, his jaw tight. Linda flipped through a glossy magazine she clearly wasn't reading. 3 people, each rehearsing the same performance. Calm indifference. I'd seen better acting in the church Christmas play. My eyes fell on the scarf in my lap, the one I'd tied so carefully that morning. If Henry had gone through the trouble of leaving something outside the legal process, it meant he didn't trust the people inside that room. And if he didn't trust them, why should I? The thought sent a slow burn through my chest. Not the sharp sting of betrayal this time, but the low, steady heat of resolve. I had been the caregiver, the peacemaker, the one who kept the family glued together. That version of me had been easy to dismiss, to push out of the room. This version, the one holding the last pieces of Henry's truth, she wasn't leaving quietly. I thought I had time to slip away from that law office, drive down the harbor road, and get to Tom's place before anyone realized there was more to Henry's final wishes than they knew. I was wrong. The first sign came before I even left the building. As I stepped out into the parking lot, Sophie was leaning against Ryan's SUV, phone pressed to her ear. She ended the call the moment she saw me. "Heading home, Margaret?" she asked, her voice all polite sweetness, but with that same cold glint in her eyes. "For now," I said. "Good. You'll need the rest. We've been concerned about your health lately." My stomach dropped. That was the opening line of a play I'd heard before, the same one she used when she started sowing doubts about my mental state to Henry. "Don't worry about me," I said, keeping my tone steady. "I'm just fine." She smiled, slow and thin. "That's not what Dr. Peters says." Dr. Peters, Henry's old cardiologist, was a friend of Linda's. He had no business commenting on my health. My fingers tightened around my keys, the little brass ones Henry had worn smooth over the years. "See you soon," she added, slipping into the SUV. The engine roared to life, and they pulled away, leaving the scent of exhaust hanging in the humid air. By the time I reached Tom's, he was waiting on the porch, hands shoved into his pockets. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "2 folks came by this morning, asking about Henry's fishing gear. One of them was Linda." "Fishing gear?" I frowned. "That's where Henry kept the lockbox," Tom explained. "Figured she was fishing for more than rods and tackle." He disappeared into the house and came back with a metal box, small enough to tuck under one arm, but heavy. He set it on the kitchen table and clicked it open. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, a thumb drive, and Henry's old pocket watch. One envelope was addressed to me in his handwriting, slanted, careful. My throat tightened. "Read it later," Tom said. "For now, you need to know. Word's going around that Ryan and Sophie are talking to a lawyer about guardianship. They're saying you can't manage your affairs." I stared at him. "Guardianship? I'm not incapacitated." "Doesn't matter. If they can get a doctor to sign off, they can tie up your accounts until it's settled. And with Peters in their corner..." He let the sentence hang. My mind raced. This was more than cutting me out of a will. This was an attempt to strip me of control over my own life. "Tom," I said, "I need copies of everything in here, and I need a safe place to keep them." He nodded. "I've got a friend at the marina with a safety deposit box, not in your name, so they won't know to look." As we worked, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Cole, this is Nurse Haverly from Dr. Peters' office. We'd like to schedule a cognitive assessment at your earliest convenience." I stared at the screen, a bitter laugh catching in my throat. Cognitive assessment. They weren't wasting time. "They're moving fast," I told Tom. "So do we," he said, slipping the copies into a manila folder. "First thing tomorrow, you see a doctor you trust. Get your own records updated, something official to prove you're fit." That night, back home, the house felt different, quieter, but not in the peaceful way it used to, when Henry and I would sit on the porch listening to the crickets. This quiet was the kind that made you check the locks twice. I kept the lockbox close, hidden under the loose floorboard in the bedroom, the same place I'd once kept Ryan's Christmas presents when he was little. Around 10 p.m., my phone rang, no caller ID. I answered anyway. A man's voice, clipped and formal. "Mrs. Cole, this is a courtesy call from Mr. Jacobs' office. We've had some concerns raised about your capacity to interpret the provisions of the will. I'd like to arrange a follow-up meeting to clarify matters." "Who raised these concerns?" I asked. "I'm not at liberty to say." My jaw tightened. Then I'm not at liberty to meet. I hung up before he could reply. I sat there for a long time staring at the darkened porch through the front window. The outline of the old oak swayed in the wind, its branches tapping the siding like a warning. They were closing in, trying to make me doubt myself, to corner me into compliance. But they'd underestimated me. I'd spent decades as a nurse, calm under pressure, steady in chaos. I knew how to chart a course through a storm. And now, with Henry's lockbox and Tom's help, I had the compass I needed. They wanted me out of the picture. I was about to paint myself right into the center of the frame. 2 days later, I walked back into Mr. Jacobs' office with my head high, and Henry's scarf looped loosely around my neck. I'd already seen my own doctor, passed every cognitive test they could throw at me, and had the paperwork neatly folded in my purse, proof I was of sound mind. Ryan, Sophie, and Linda were already seated at the polished mahogany table, their voices low. Sophie's eyes flicked up when I entered, a faint trace of irritation tightening her mouth. "Glad you could make it," Mr. Jacobs said, his tone pointed enough to make me think he'd been waiting for me to have my say. I sat down opposite my son, resting my hands calmly on the table. "Let's hear it," I said. Mr. Jacobs adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder. "This is the last will and testament of Henry James Cole," he began, "executed 6 months before his death, in full possession of his mental faculties." His gaze shifted deliberately toward Ryan and Sophie. The first few clauses were standard: bequest to charities, small personal items to friends. Sophie sat straighter when Mr. Jacobs turned a page, as if ready to collect what she believed was hers. "To my wife, Margaret," he read, "I leave our home, all joint bank accounts, and the riverfront property on Edisto Island." Sophie's mouth twitched, but she stayed quiet. Mr. Jacobs continued, his voice steady. "To my son, Ryan, and his wife, Sophie, I leave the sum of $5,000. "What?" Sophie's chair scraped loudly against the floor. Mr. Jacobs didn't pause. to be held in trust until they can demonstrate 1 full year of consistent, respectful care toward Margaret. If this condition is not met, the funds will be donated to the Charleston Fishermen's Relief Fund. Ryan's head jerked up. "This isn't right," he said sharply. "Dad never—" "Your father anticipated you might feel that way," Mr. Jacobs interrupted, "which is why he also prepared an addendum." He reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of handwritten pages. Henry's writing. Neat, but with the faint tremor I remembered from his final months. "I have observed," Mr. Jacobs read, "with deep concern, my son's and daughter-in-law's treatment of Margaret during my illness, their neglect of her well-being, their attempts to exclude her from medical decisions, and their preoccupation with inheritance over compassion have convinced me they are unfit to manage my legacy." Sophie's face went pale. Linda's hand froze on her pearl necklace. "Furthermore," Mr. Jacobs went on, "I am aware of discussions between Ryan, Sophie, and Linda to have Margaret declared incompetent to manage her own affairs, despite decades of her successfully managing our household and finances." Ryan's voice cracked. "He's making it sound—" "I have documented," Mr. Jacobs continued firmly, "dates, times, and statements, including a phone call in which Sophie stated Margaret was forgetful, unreliable, and mentally declining, while Margaret was, at that very moment, preparing my medication with perfect accuracy." Sophie's cheeks flushed a deep red. "That's taken out of context." "There is no context in which lying about your mother-in-law's mental state is acceptable," Mr. Jacobs said, his professional tone sharpening. Then he unfolded a smaller, sealed envelope. "Henry also left a personal letter for this moment." The room seemed to shrink as he read, "To my son Ryan, if you are hearing this, it means you have challenged my decisions. I want you to know they were made with clear mind and heavy heart. You saw my illness as a disruption to your life. Margaret saw it as the final chapter of ours and met it with love and care. I will not entrust my life's work to someone who would treat the woman I love with such disregard." The week after the will reading felt like the first breath after surfacing from deep water, sharp, burning, but alive. Everywhere I went in town, people seemed to know. Charleston has a way of carrying stories faster than the tides. Some looked at me with quiet nods of approval, others with the kind of curiosity that comes from knowing just enough to gossip. Sophie and Linda didn't take it well. 2 days later, Sophie resigned from the junior league. For personal reasons. A friend at the farmer's market told me she'd overheard someone whisper about the humiliation at the lawyer's office. Linda stopped showing up at her Wednesday luncheons altogether. Ryan was complicated. He showed up at my house one evening just after sunset. The cicadas were screaming in the trees, and the porch light caught the edge of his face, making him look younger, almost like the boy I'd raised. "Mom," he began, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I didn't know Dad had written those notes, or that he'd—" His voice trailed off. I leaned against the porch railing. "You didn't have to know, Ryan. You saw what was happening. You let it happen." He flinched, like the truth was heavier than he'd expected. "I was trying to keep the peace." "Peace isn't the absence of conflict," I said quietly. "It's the presence of respect." And there was none. He looked away toward the oak tree in the yard. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I can't change what I did, but I'd like to be better. If you'll let me. I nodded slowly. Being better starts with boundaries, Ryan, and you need to understand. I'll be keeping mine. That night, after he left, I sat in the quiet of the living room, Henry's lockbox open on the coffee table. I'd moved the contents to a small safe in my bedroom, but I kept the box itself where I could see it, a reminder that the truth, once brought into the light, can't be stuffed back into a dark corner. My own health couldn't wait any longer. The following week, I flew to Florida to start treatment at a cancer center Henry had researched himself. The building was bright and airy, with wide windows looking out over palm trees and the ocean beyond. On my first day, the nurse tied a soft hospital gown at my back and said, "Your husband did his homework. This is one of the best facilities in the country." I smiled even as my chest tightened with the memory of him. He always did. Chemotherapy wasn't easy. The nausea came in waves. My hair thinned, and there were days when I could barely stand without bracing against the counter. But unlike before, I wasn't doing it alone in secret. This time, I allowed myself to accept help. From the nurses, from Tom, even from a neighbor who started dropping off casseroles on Thursdays. Ryan called every Sunday. Sometimes the conversations were awkward, heavy with things neither of us could undo. But sometimes he'd tell me about a fishing trip he took with his buddy, or ask if I'd seen the new walking trail near Folly Beach. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was movement. Sophie never called. I heard through the grapevine that she and Ryan were taking a break. Some said it was about the embarrassment. Others whispered about money troubles. I didn't ask. Her silence was its own kind of closure. One afternoon, Linda showed up unannounced. I saw her through the kitchen window, standing on the porch in a neatly pressed dress, clutching her handbag like it was armor. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "Margaret," she said, her voice more brittle than I'd ever heard it. "I came to apologize." She swallowed hard. "I thought I was protecting the family. I see now I was just protecting my own position." I studied her face, the lines deeper, the eyes a little less sure. "It's not my job to decide what you do with that realization, Linda," I said, "but it is my job to protect my peace." She nodded once, tightly, and walked away without another word. By the time autumn rolled around, my treatments were nearly done. My hair was starting to grow back in soft silver fuzz. I'd found a rhythm in Florida. Morning walks by the water, afternoons with a book on the balcony, evenings video calling Ryan, when he remembered. The bitterness hadn't vanished. Some wounds don't close neatly. But there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing I'd faced them down. Not just Sophie and Linda, but the part of myself that once believed silence was safer than standing up. The money Henry left me paid for my treatment, but the real gift was the reminder that my worth had never been in question. Not to him, and now, finally, not to me either. 18 months after that day in Mr. Jacobs' office, I stood barefoot on the deck of my little cottage in Key Largo, a mug of coffee warming my hands. The morning air was thick with salt, and the sun was just lifting over the water, scattering gold across the waves. My hair had grown back in soft curls, silver and brighter than I ever remembered it. I decided not to dye it. Every strand felt like proof of what I'd survived. The scarf Henry used to wear now hung framed on my bedroom wall, a reminder of the man who'd seen me fully, even when others tried to make me disappear. Life here was simple, I painted, badly, but with joy. I joined a small community garden where the locals swapped tomatoes for stories. On Thursdays, I volunteered at the hospice center, sitting with patients who didn't have family nearby. I understood that particular loneliness too well. Ryan visited every few months. The visits were shorter than I imagined they'd be, but warmer. He'd help me fix a leaky faucet. I'd make him his favorite shrimp and grits, and we'd talk about small things, the kind of conversations that don't fix the past, but build something new in its place. We didn't talk about Sophie. We didn't need to. One afternoon, after a long walk by the mangroves, Ryan handed me an envelope. Inside was a photo of him as a boy, sitting on Henry's lap in our old living room. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "I remember." I didn't cry. Not then. I just smiled, feeling something loosen inside me. As for Linda, she never visited again. I heard she moved into a senior community upstate. Sometimes I wondered if she still thought about that day in the lawyer's office, or if she'd rewritten it in her mind. But I learned not to carry that weight for her. The day I got the call from my doctor telling me I was officially cancer-free, I didn't throw a party or post about it online. Instead, I drove down to the pier at sunset, kicked off my sandals, and let the warm Gulf water lap at my ankles. A pelican skimmed the surface just a few feet away, and for a moment it felt like the world was perfectly still. That's when I realized survival isn't just about making it through the storm. It's about letting yourself step into the sunlight without looking back for the next cloud. I'd spent decades believing love had to be earned through sacrifice, through putting myself last. Henry's last gift to me wasn't the house or the money or even the lockbox. It was permission to take up space in my own life. Now I take my coffee on the deck every morning. I paint even when the gulls look like lopsided clouds. I plant marigolds that probably won't survive the salt air. I laugh with neighbors. I watch the storms roll in from the west. And when I think of Henry, I think of him smiling, not in a hospital bed but out on the water, sun on his face. If you've made it this far into my story, I want to ask you something. What would you do if you were given a second chance, not just to live, but to live on your own terms? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and maybe, just maybe, I'll read your story next time. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that every life has chapters worth telling. And some of them can only be written after the storm has passed.